Hey y'all, thanks so much for joining me today. My name is Tesha and I'm the owner of the Cajun Girl Patterns. Today I'm going to talk to you about what is knit fabric, and then I'm going to walk you through everything you need to know to choose your fabric, prepare your fabric, and sew it. I'll be sharing 5 amazing tips with you. If you're new to sewing knit, or if you just want a quick refresher, this is the video for you. If you enjoy this video, please visit my website at thecajungirl.com to learn more great tips. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that I think we should talk about is what exactly is knit fabric. Fabrics can be broken down, of course, into 2 main categories, knits and wovens. The difference between these 2 broad types of fabrics is how the fibers are actually put together. Knit fabrics are looped together, and when you look at the fabric up close, it looks like braids or loops. Woven fabric is more of a basket weave pattern. You have a cross grain and a straight grain, and this gives it a very rigid structure. These 2 weaving patterns or techniques are what give the fabric their characteristics. The difference between these 2 fabrics, of course, is the stretch. Knit fabrics are stretchy. They allow for you to make comfortable, well-fitted garments without the need of closures like buttons and zippers, which is a big win. Knits can be much easier to sew than wovens if you have a few tips. I'm going to share with you, of course, 5 amazing tips to help you sew knit fabrics with a breeze. Okay, tip number 1, choose the right knit fabric for your pattern. So now you've selected the pattern that you want to sew. Now you need to buy fabric, which of course is the best part. Every pattern should contain a list of recommended fabrics that you should use for your specific pattern. You want to find this section. This is where the designer has listed the type of fabric that will give you the right look for your finished garment. So for the best result, you should choose one of these fabrics. If you are very experienced and you feel comfortable going outside those recommendations, that's fine. You may have to allow more ease, or if you can adjust those patterns, feel comfortable doing that. But if you're a beginner, you want to stay within these fabric recommendations for the best result. Another key to choosing the right knit fabric is to choose the right amount of stretch. What does that mean? How do you decide if your fabric has enough stretch? I'll give you 2 examples of how to calculate the stretch you need for your pattern. The first way to determine the stretch is by using Pick a Knit. This is available on commercial patterns. Let me show you in the camera. It's usually on this top part of the pattern. And what you want to do is you take a piece of knit fabric, your sample fabric, maybe you want to use this nice stripe, and you put it on the end like this, fold it in half, and then you pull it. And this fabric, you can see the end mark is here, and this fabric is not going to work. It's not stretchy enough. So let's try another knit, okay? And let's put this on the end and then give it a stretch. So this one's very stretchy. This one will work. So the first fabric was not stretchy enough, but the second one would work. So you can use this. If you choose a fabric that's not stretchy enough, it won't have enough stretch for the finished garment. The finished garment's going to be too tight, or you may not even be able to get it on. I mean, not good. Okay, the second way to determine stretch is a little bit different. Indie sewing patterns may not contain the Pick a Knit or a stretch guide. Some do, some don't, but they will list the amount of stretch that you need for your pattern. So how do you determine the percentage of stretch? The way that you can do this is you take a piece of knit fabric, let's say it's 10 inches long. So let's just say 10. And then you go ahead and stretch it. And let's see, where do we make it to? 13. So that fabric stretched 3 inches. So that's 30% stretch. However far the fabric stretches, that's the percentage of stretch that your fabric has. So for example, if I stretch the fabric from 10 to 12, that's 20%. 3 inches would be 30%, 5 is 50%, etc. So now you know what type of knit fabric that you need, how much stretch it should have. The last thing that you need to consider is the directional stretch. Knits can either have 2-way or 4-way stretch. This just means how many different directions the knit can actually stretch. 4-way stretch, the knit stretch in every direction. This one's 4-way. You know, it's really, really stretchy in all ways. 2-way stretch, it only stretches along the horizontal plane and of course the bias. But this, it doesn't have a lot of stretch along the length. So now you have all the information you need to choose the right fabric for your sewing project. So now let's dive into my second tip. Okay, tip number 2, wash your fabric. This is one of the biggest tips that I'm going to share with you. Knit fabric shrinks. And when I say shrink, I mean up to 20%. If you take nothing else from this video, this tip is huge. Wash your fabric exactly like you plan to do the finished garment. Do not skip this step. The yardage that is calculated in most patterns does not account for fabric shrinkage. You may need to buy up to 1/4 yard more fabric than's recommended on your pattern. Nothing is more frustrating than washing the fabric and then not having enough to cut out your pattern. So now that we're talking about, cutting out pattern pieces, that brings me to my next tip. Tip number 3, cutting out knit fabric. One of the most frustrating things about knit fabric is that the cut-in rolls. It's kind of annoying. See how rolled this piece is? The struggle is real. It can be so annoying to try to lay out pattern pieces on an end that will not lie flat. I have a great tip for this though. One way to keep the knit fabric flat is to spray it with spray starch and then press it with a hot iron. So here's 2 pieces that I cut, and then this one I spray starched and this one I did nothing with. And you can see the difference. The clear difference. This one's nice and straight. But this is not a permanent fix. The more that you manipulate the starch piece, it'll start to roll again. So if I roll it in between my hands, you can see it starting to curl. So the more you manipulate it, the more that it'll start rolling. So you can just starch it again and press it. But it's a good temporary way to keep everything nice and flat just so you can cut it out. You can also use this when you're stitching it and trying to get the the ends so you can make your seam. You can give them a quick starch and press it, and then you can get it pinned so that it's all lined up and you have the right seam allowance. Okay, so that's how you can sort of cut out your fabric and manipulate it easily. Now we're going to talk about our next tip. The 4th tip I'd like to share with you is all about knit notions. What items do you need that are unique to knit fabrics? There are 2 items that I would highly, highly recommend purchasing. They're both inexpensive. The first is ballpoint pens. And the second is a jersey sewing needle for your sewing machine. The reason that you need these items is because regular straight pins are sharper and they can pierce and cut the fabric loops and create a hole in your fabric. The same is true for universal, really sharp needles. You really need to use a ballpoint pen and stretch needle on your machine. Both of these items are inexpensive and well worth the purchase. There's only one tip left, and it's all about stitching the fabric. Okay, now it's time for my last tip, tip number 5, and probably the most important is stitching. So how do we actually stitch knit fabric? first, as I mentioned in tip 4, you really do need to put a stretch needle on your machine, one of these needles. Also, if you have one, a walking foot is nice too, but it's not necessary. Now that you have your ballpoint needle in your machine, you know, what stitch should you use? Definitely not a straight stitch. Knit fabric cannot simply be stitched like a regular woven fabric. The whole point of the fabric is to stretch. A regular stitch will be stable and it won't allow the fabric to stretch at all. So one of two things will happen when you use a straight stitch. You will either not be able to get the garment over your head or on your body, or when you pull it on, the stitches will actually rip because there's no stretch in the stitches. So how can you fix this? It's pretty easy. You just need to use a stretch stitch, a stitch that will stretch with the fabric. My machine has a specific stretch stitch that is recommended for knit fabrics. You should check your manual to see if your machine has this as well. If not, it's not a big deal. This stitch is just a small zigzag. Or I've seen some of the stitches that will stitch 3 straight stitches and then there's a zag, and then it'll continue to stitch and keep zagging to build in that stretch. If you can't find any of these, you can just play around with a zigzag stitch. You know, just shorten the stitch width and the length until you get the right tension for your fabric. Here's an example of the fabric that I've sewn with my stretch stitch. You can see it's a tiny little zigzag, and look how great it stretches without ripping. So also when you're sewing fabrics together and you're having trouble with the hem, if it's rolling and you're having a difficult time putting the seam allowance together, you can also spray starch it and press it, and it'll keep it nice and flat as well. So that's it. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that I helped you solve some of the common problems that come up with knit fabric. If you have a great tip, leave it in the comments below. Also, if you found this video helpful, give it a like or subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any great content. You can also find me on all social media channels at The Cajun Girl. Thanks. Bye.